What if the reason your child doesn't listen has nothing to do with discipline, respect, or behavior at all? What if every time you repeat yourself or raise your voice, you're responding to something that never actually happened inside your child's brain? Here's something I never thought I'd admit out loud. For a long time, I believed my child wasn't listening because they didn't want to, because they were being stubborn, or because somehow I wasn't firm enough as a parent. And every time I had to repeat myself again and again and again, that belief quietly grew stronger. What no one warned me about was how heavy that belief becomes over time. You start questioning your child, then your parenting, and eventually yourself. I remember standing in the middle of the room, asking for something simple, just one small thing, and watching nothing happen. No reaction, no eye contact, no sign that my words had even landed. It felt personal, almost insulting. And in those moments, my voice would rise before my thinking caught up. But here's the part that still unsettles me. What if my child wasn't ignoring me at all? What if the real problem wasn't behavior, or respect, or discipline, but the fact that I was speaking a language their brain literally couldn't understand yet? That question stopped me cold. Because if that were true, then every time I raised my voice, every time I assumed defiance, I wasn't teaching my child to listen. I was responding to something that never actually happened. I didn't want another parenting trick. I wasn't looking for a stricter rule or a better consequence. I wanted to know what was really going on inside a developing brain when a child seems to tune you out. And the more I learned, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Children aren't wired to receive adult communication the way we think they are. The way we speak, especially when we're stressed, rushed, or frustrated, often overwhelms their brain before they even have a chance to respond. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it, and it raised a question that changed everything for me. If I change the way I speak, not to control my child, but to match how their brain actually works, what else might change too? That's where this story really begins. That question stayed with me because once you start wondering whether your child truly can't hear you in the way you expect, you're forced to look more closely at what's happening in those moments of silence. I began to notice something I had overlooked for years. When my child was playing, building, watching something, or lost in their own little world, their focus was absolute. It wasn't casual attention, it was deep, immersive concentration, the kind that pulls everything else out of awareness. And suddenly it became obvious why my words so often seemed to disappear into thin air. We tend to assume that if a child is in the same room, they should be able to hear us. But hearing and being available to listen are not the same thing. When children enter this state of deep focus, their brain filters out anything that isn't directly related to what they're doing. It's not disrespect. It's not defiance. It's a neurological state. I started thinking of it like invisible noise-canceling headphones. Not the kind you put on deliberately, but the kind the brain creates on its own when it's fully engaged. From the outside, it looks like ignoring. From the inside, nothing else exists. What made this realization even harder to sit with was recognizing how I usually responded. I spoke from across the room. I stacked instructions on top of one another. And when there was no response, I got louder. Without meaning to, I was asking a developing nervous system to shift gears instantly, from deep focus into compliance, without any transition at all. There's another layer to this that we rarely talk about. When adults stand over children and issue commands, even calmly, the body can interpret that posture as pressure. For a child's nervous system, that pressure can trigger stress responses: fight, flight, or freeze. And once that happens, listening becomes even less likely. So I tried something that felt almost too simple to matter. Instead of speaking first, I moved closer. I lowered myself to eye level. I touched my child's arm gently. I said their name and waited, not impatiently, not with expectation, just waited until they looked at me. That moment of eye contact changed the atmosphere completely. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. But in that pause, something fundamental shifted. My child wasn't being pulled out of their world anymore. They were being invited into a shared one. And that's when I realized something that reshaped how I communicate. Before instructions can work, connection has to exist. Once that connection was finally there, I expected everything else to fall into place. but it didn't. And that's when I realized connection alone wasn't the whole story. Even when my child was looking right at me, even when I knew they were listening, the results were inconsistent. Sometimes they'd start doing what I asked, then stop halfway. Other times they'd freeze, like they didn't know where to begin. And I remember thinking, I was clear. So why isn't this working? That question led me to something I had never truly considered before: how much information a child's brain can actually hold at one time. I learned about working memory, the part of the brain that temporarily stores information so we can act on it. The simplest way I've heard it explained is this: working memory is like a whiteboard in your mind. You write instructions on it, use them, then erase them. As adults, our whiteboards are fairly large. We can write several things at once, rearrange them, prioritize. But even ours shrink dramatically when we're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. A child's whiteboard, on the other hand, is tiny. And suddenly, so many moments made sense. When I said, clean up your toys, put on your shoes, grab your bag, and wait by the door, I wasn't being efficient. I was filling that whiteboard faster than my child's brain could process. By the time they reached the second step, the first one was already fading. By the time I finished speaking, the board was full. What happens next isn't laziness or resistance. It's overload. Some kids respond by doing part of what they remember. Others shut down entirely because the task feels too big before it even begins. And the more overwhelmed they feel, the less capable they become of starting. That realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I wasn't speaking for my child's brain. I was speaking for mine. Matching instructions to a child's developmental stage isn't about lowering standards. It's about making success neurologically possible. One step for very young toddlers, two closely related steps as they grow, gradually adding complexity as their capacity expands. I also noticed how often my words were vague without me realizing it. Clean up, get ready, behave. These phrases make perfect sense to adults, but to a child's brain, they're abstract and overwhelming. Clear, concrete language, put the blocks in the bin, gives the brain something it can actually act on. And then there was another shift that mattered just as much: saying what to do instead of what not to do. A child's brain doesn't easily translate stop into an action, but walk or sit creates an immediate mental picture. Once I began shaping my words to fit the size of my child's mental whiteboard, something surprising happened. Cooperation didn't require more effort. It required less. Once my words finally fit my child's brain, I assumed the hardest part was over, until I realized I was still rushing something that couldn't be rushed at all. Even with clear, simple instructions, there were moments when nothing seemed to happen. I'd say what needed to be done, and my child would just stand there. And every instinct in me wanted to jump in, to repeat myself, to prompt, to push the moment forward. Silence felt like failure. Waiting felt like weakness. But what I was missing was the invisible work happening inside my child's brain. For an adult, action feels almost immediate. We hear a request and move. But for a child, there's a process unfolding beneath the surface. Their brain has to register the words, make sense of them, decide what comes first, and then coordinate their body to act. That entire sequence doesn't happen instantly. It takes time, real time, often 7 to 10 seconds. Those seconds feel endless when you're watching them. I began to notice how often I interrupted that process without realizing it. I'd repeat the instruction after 2 seconds, or add extra words, or change my tone. Each time, I was essentially erasing the whiteboard and starting over, forcing my child's brain back to the beginning. So I tried something that felt deeply uncomfortable at first. I stayed quiet. I stayed close. I grounded myself. I counted silently. And I let the pause exist without filling it. What surprised me was how often, right around that moment when I was about to speak again, my child would move. Slowly at first, hesitantly sometimes. But they were moving, processing, deciding, acting. And when they did, I learned not to rush past it. Instead of a quick, automatic good job, I began naming exactly what I saw. You put your shoes on. You walked to the sink when I asked. It wasn't about praise for praise's sake. It was about helping my child understand what they had done right. That specificity mattered. It built clarity, it built confidence, and over time, it built something even more powerful: the understanding that listening the first time leads to connection, not pressure. The pause changed me as much as it changed my child. It taught me that patience isn't passive. It's an active choice to trust a developing brain to do what it's capable of, if I give it the space to do so. And even with connection, clear words, and patient waiting, there were still moments when my child didn't move at all. And that's where the final shift had to happen. For a long time, I treated those moments as proof that the approach wasn't working. That if my child didn't respond, I needed to escalate. Firmer tone, repeated reminders, maybe even a threat. But the truth was harder to face. My child wasn't refusing. They were stuck. Sometimes the instruction was still too big. Sometimes their body didn't know how to start. Sometimes their emotions were louder than my words. And none of that meant they were choosing not to listen. This is where my understanding of support had to change. Instead of repeating myself endlessly or backing away in frustration, I learned to step in immediately, calmly, and with intention. Not to take over and not to rescue, but to guide my child through the action while staying connected. If my child didn't respond, I simplified the request again. If that still wasn't enough, I broke it into the smallest possible step. And when words alone didn't work, I used my presence. I pointed. I modeled. I gently helped their body begin the movement. What surprised me most was how powerful that consistency became. There was no yelling, no bargaining, no waiting for compliance to magically appear. Just a quiet message, repeated through action instead of volume. When I ask you to do something, I will help you follow through. Every time. And something shifted. My child began to resist less, not more. Not because they were being controlled, but because the uncertainty disappeared. Ignoring me no longer delayed the task, and struggling didn't lead to pressure, it led to support. Over time, I noticed I was helping less. My child was starting sooner, acting faster, listening earlier. Not because they were afraid of consequences, but because the path forward felt clear and safe. There were still hard days, days when nothing flowed smoothly, days when emotions ran high. And I stopped seeing those days as failures. Children aren't machines. They have moods, limits, and off moments, just like we do. The goal was never perfect obedience. It was trust. Trust that when I speak, I mean what I say. Trust that when my child struggles, I won't abandon or overpower them. Trust built not through intensity, but through presence. And that's when I understood what listening the first time is really about. It isn't about control. It's about building a relationship where understanding comes first and cooperation grows from there. When I look back at everything this journey taught me, I realized the biggest shift wasn't in my child at all. It was in me. I used to believe that listening was something I needed to extract from my child. That if I found the right tone, the right rule, or the right consequence, cooperation would finally appear. But what I slowly learned is that listening isn't pulled out of children. It's built, layer by layer, through how safe, clear, and supported they feel in the moments we speak to them. What changed everything was understanding that a child's behavior is not a moral statement. It's information. It tells us what their brain and nervous system can handle right now. When we respond to behavior with curiosity instead of judgment, we stop fighting the child in front of us and start working with the child we actually have. The real lesson here goes far beyond parenting. We live in a world that rewards speed, volume, and control. We rush conversations. We interrupt processing. We expect instant responses, not just from children, but from everyone. And then we wonder why connection feels fragile and misunderstandings pile up. What this experience taught me is that slowing down doesn't mean losing authority. Clarity doesn't mean being harsh, and support doesn't mean weakness. In fact, the more we align our communication with how humans actually process information, especially under stress, the more cooperation naturally emerges. You can apply this everywhere. In your relationships, notice how often you speak before the other person is ready to hear you. At work, consider whether your instructions overwhelm instead of guide. With yourself, recognize how often pressure replaces patience when you're struggling to start. Listening, real listening, begins with connection, then clarity, then time, and finally support. Children simply reveal this truth more honestly than adults do. When we change how we speak, we don't just raise better listeners. We become better communicators, partners, and leaders. And the ripple effects of that reach far beyond one household. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this approach resonated with you the most? Connection, clarity, patience, or support? Please share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective as well. And if this video helped you see communication in a new way, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support truly helps keep these conversations going and motivates us to create more thoughtful, practical content for you.